We now turn our attention to 2 Corinthians, and when we do so, we take a look at the map. We see the travels of Paul on his third missionary journey, and kind of get a sense of where Paul went. You know, it's interesting that if 1 Corinthians had been successful, Paul would have not had any need to write 2 Corinthians, right? So it's pretty obvious that the church's problems continued and persisted. In fact, despite many of Paul's efforts, we know that Paul wrote many letters, maybe 4 letters to the Corinthian church. And this shows us that it was really difficult for Paul to deal with these issues. In 2 Corinthians, one of the things that he addresses as a major issue are what are called the super apostles, which is a kind of an interesting description for them. They seem to be discrediting Paul. They seem to be calling into question his apostleship, the skill of his oratory. Is he really that good of a speaker? And in fact, his very gospel itself. So whoever these people are, they regard themselves as superior to Paul, and hence Paul calls them the super apostles. Paul was in Macedonia on his third missionary journey for several years. Corinth was only about 5 hours away by ship, and so Paul could easily stay in contact with the Corinthians and their situation. We know from 1 Corinthians that visitors came from Corinth and that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. We also know Timothy brought him news and that Paul had some further challenges to deal with there. Question is did Paul make another trip to Corinth that was rejected and had to write a tearful letter sending it to Titus? He certainly wants Titus to gauge the situation, and we see that he wants to meet him in Macedonia before his arrival at Corinth, and that Titus brings good news, but also some bad news. The super apostles have shown up. So he's filled with relief and dread, and he writes 2 Corinthians in the fall of AD 56. That seems to be kind of the situation. Now, one of the things that scholars, many of them very critical and questioning of Corinthians, have called into question whether or not it's a unified book or not. Is this one letter or several of them sort of pieced together? Is chapters 1 through 9 one section, while 10 through 13 another? And our author concludes, no, these fragmental explanations fail to account for how an editor would put together, various copies and preserve the unity of something. Thus, the tearful letter has been lost, and 2 Corinthians 2 deals with different issues, shifting focus and tone in chapters 9 through 10 to super apostles, but not writing a new letter. 2 Corinthians follows a general pattern of the day. When we look at exhortation style of letters, there's greetings, there's thanksgiving, there's body, there's closing, and final closing. So when you study letters of the ancient world, you see Paul's fits a pretty similar pattern. If you're to outline 2 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, you'd see greetings, thanksgiving, Paul's reasons, Paul's defense, personal appeal to contribution to Judea, the defense of his ministry. Paul boasts as a fool, his plans for a visit, and his closing. The reconciliation of Paul and the Corinthians in chapters 1 through 9, you could sort of summarize that in that way. It's very personal. It's very autobiographical. And in the first 2 chapters, Paul and his travel plans to Corinth, we see here 2 major themes: suffering and consolation. Chapters 2 through 7, Paul focuses on Christian leadership. He's saying he did not charge anybody, rhetorically asking if he needs letters of recommendation, to sort of defend himself. The super apostles are claiming their religious authority and rivaling Paul and speaking of the glory of Moses. And Paul says they are like Moses behind the veil, but that he brings a new covenant. So he's happy to say they're like Moses, and he's saying, I'm like Jesus, if you will. They say Paul is weak, but he says that treasures can be held in clay pots. Chapters 8 through 9, Paul talks about his collection for Judea. There's a Judean famine going on. There's a need for relief. He makes his appeals to national rivalry. He tells them, hey, the Macedonians have given. They're poor, and they've outgiven you guys. Of course, the Corinthians competed against the Macedonians in the Greek games, and so that natural rivalry was something Paul appealed to, which is interesting. That the great apostle would do that. He mentions things that mentions this also to the Galatians, to the Macedonians, to the Koreans and the Romans. I should say the Corinthians and the Romans. And Paul is concerned in this letter about the plight of the Jews. I mean, this is the purpose for the offering. He's not advancing himself. He's advancing the needs of the poor living in Jerusalem. In chapters 10 through 13, we see Paul's confrontation with these super apostles. He describes them as he does Satan masquerading as an angel of light. They took money. Paul did not. He appealed to the Corinthians. He also takes in some of the language and of the patron-client system. Whoever gives somebody money is greater than them, because in the patron-client system, the person who had the money would distribute it to the client who needed the money. So why does Paul refuse? It is because their giving should be motivated for the right reason. So he's not asking for it as though he were less than them, their client, and they his patron. But he's asking for it because of the right reasons. And finally, the consensus view is that Paul wrote this in the year AD 56.